Hi everyone, Mike from Objective Secured here. We're going to be talking today about a video I've seen recently doing the rounds on the internet by a channel called Tactical Tortoise. Now before you do anything else, you should go and check out their channel. They do some great content. And recently they put out a video that kind of perked my interest as a player and as an organizer. And it was 8 things that players are getting wrong. Now, I think by and large the content in the video is really great for the community, but there are some things in there that I found a little bit confusing. So I just wanted to publish this video just to kind of give my thoughts and obviously include some rules references in my video to kind of show you where my understanding for some of these queries comes from. So let's dive straight into the 8 things that players are getting wrong in 40k. Right, number 1 is measuring distance and line of sight. Now, they do an excellent job of explaining how in 9th edition Warhammer 40,000 in the shooting phase you have to have range and line of sight to a single model in order for you to be able to shoot that enemy unit. All 100% correct. And that is a change from 8th edition where we had a bit of ambiguity where you could have one model out of line of sight but in range and another model out of range but in line of sight and still meet the criteria to target the unit. That's no longer the case. So 100% agree with everything they bring up there. Where it gets a little bit fuzzy for me is his comparison to the psychic phase. Now, the way psychic powers work is you declare which power you're using with which psyker, you roll to attempt to manifest, then your opponent, if within 24-inch range, may attempt to deny your psychic power. Once that sequence is completed, if the power is not denied and you've successfully rolled to manifest, then the power takes effect and you resolve the power's effects. Now, in his video, he talks about how psychic powers can kind of target the way 8th edition used to work, where you could have range to one target that was out of line of sight and line of sight to a model in the same unit but not in range, and that would qualify you to target that squad. That is kind of true, but it's also kind of not true, because the psychic phase doesn't actually have any targeting rules of its own, because each power has its own individual clauses and requirements for targeting. Specifically, what he's referencing in that video is Smite. Now, Smite only requires you to have range and line of sight to a unit, not a model, which obviously then comes back to I can have range to one model that is out of line of sight, and line of sight to a model in the same unit but not be in range of that particular model and still meet the criteria because I'm targeting the unit, not a model. So he is correct in his video that under Smite, that's 100% correct. But there are a number of other psychic powers that are targeted differently, and like I say, the psychic phase doesn't have targeting rules in it. So it's important that you read whatever power you're playing and make sure that you follow its targeting rules correctly. Point 2, Wobbly Model is basically what we're talking about for this point. Now, I'm not quite sure why or how he's reached the conclusion with this one. This is actually the only point I just outright disagree with. Page 199 of the big rulebook actually clarifies how and when you can use Wobbly Model syndrome in order to place a model and then instead of it not fitting right, you can put a base down. That's not what it actually says. What it says is that if a model can physically be placed, but it's not stable, as long as you can physically place it there, then you can take it away and put a blank base or a marker to identify where that model is. So it doesn't allow you to put a model where it physically can't fit, regardless of how its wings are posed, how its tail is, whips and spears and banners and all the rest of it. The model has to still fit where you propose to put it. Now, in his video example, he talks about a hive tyrant with wings being sort of cornered into a building, and obviously on Tabletop Simulator its wings poke out through the building. In a real game of 40k it couldn't actually be placed there. The rules don't allow it to be placed somewhere where it physically can't be placed. So even though measurements are done to and from the base, the model still has to physically fit where you're placing it. So this is my biggest sort of concern with his video, is that this is going to lead to players bringing blank bases for really big models and then putting them in places where they can't actually fit. So there'll be a link in a second to show you that rule from the Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, 9th edition. But please, if you're coming to a tournament in particular, check to make sure what the TO's understanding of this rule is. As it's written, I believe that unless you can physically put a model in a position, you can't then exchange it for a base just because you want it to fit somewhere where it physically can't. On to point 3, which is around fly and climbing and terrain. And I think this is another one that I can understand how they've reached the conclusions they have, but I also don't necessarily agree with part of what they're talking about. Now, the first sort of content of this section talks about the fly keyword and how you move with the fly keyword. Now, I 100% agree with everything he talks about here in that it doesn't measure vertical distances, it can only be used in certain circumstances, it can't be used to traverse terrain in the charge phase. There's a few different things that he talks about, which I agree with all of. The bit that I'm a bit hung up on is around the way he describes about moving through terrain. Now, there are several references in the rulebook around how you can move through terrain, and he makes a comment about having to move up to the wall of a ruin before you can move up or down that ruin. Now, I can half understand how you reach that conclusion because the first part of moving through terrain example that you get talks about exactly that. But the movement phase and the terrain rules don't seem to align with that generic set of rules, and I'd always go with specific over general. So he makes a comment about a lot of players simply moving up and down ruins without actually meeting a wall, sort of moving through floors. Now, with an obstacle that you don't actually enter, I would agree that you have to move up to it, up, across, and down again. So something like a scalable shipping container is a great example, where it's an obstacle. Once you're in area terrain, though, you're actually in the terrain, and you're given permission by the rules, particularly ruins which have scalable and breachable, to move up and down within those ruins. And there's no requirement for you to be up against a wall. So, to me, and like I say, I can completely understand how he reaches that conclusion. I actually disagree with it because I feel like the generic terrain rules, without looking at the terrain traits, he would be right. But with the terrain traits, with area terrain and obstacles being differentiated with terrain, I feel like there's a very good case to argue that no, you can actually move up and down area terrain anywhere while you're within that terrain. Obviously, you still have to count the horizontal and vertical distances, but I don't feel like you need to get up to a wall and then move up and down via the wall. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it certainly doesn't mesh with what the vast majority of the community seem to be playing it as. It certainly also doesn't line up with 8th edition rules. Now, a past edition isn't always a good example of why you should play it for a new edition. However, like I say, I'll put the references in a second on the screen so you can check them out. I could see it going either way. However, I do feel like the majority of the community will be playing it the way I'm describing it. On to point 4. This is a great point, and it's actually one that I wasn't even really aware of until I watched the video, checked the rules myself, and then came back to make this video. So this talks about the aircraft and minimum movement. Now, I think the reason this hasn't kind of hit most players' radars is to do with the models that are actually impacted by it. In his video, he describes how a flyer must essentially displace its minimum movement rather than simply measuring a distance on the table of its minimum movement. So in the example, the Archaeocopter that he uses, it moves 10 inches across the table, turns 90 degrees, and then moves 10 inches up the table, and it only ends up 14.5 inches away from its starting point, which actually breaks the 40k rule, which says that an aircraft must end its move at least its minimum distance away from where it started. So that 14.5 is obviously not the 20-inch minimum that the Archaeocopter has. So he's 100% correct that you would have to measure further in order to make that displacement distance at least 20 inches. Now, there's only 2 flyers that I can come up with that this actually impacts. One is the Archaeocopter and its variants, and the other, which was pointed out by one of our followers, is the Remora stealth drone from the Tau, which doesn't have the minimum turns that a lot of aircraft does, but it does have a minimum movement distance. The Remora probably gets around it because it still has a 15-inch displacement, but because it's on a round base, and it's not limited by which way it turns, I could see people trying to argue that you can just do circles with it and count as having moved 15, whereas the Archaeocopter is a very clear-cut case. I think the reason most players aren't aware of this rule is those 2 units are actually quite rare on most tables. The Remora stealth drones are super rare for Tau armies to field, and while the Archaeocopter certainly gained popularity in certainly in the last 12 months of events locally, it's still a flyer that is relatively uncommon in your average. You know, you might face one AdMech opponent in a tournament if you're lucky. So it's definitely a good one to be aware of, that displacement matters more for aircraft than the distance that they have as a minimum move. However, obviously, you still measure the distance that they cover in straight lines to generate their maximum movement. So in the case of the Archaeocopter, it could move 10, turn, move 50, and that would be its 60-inch total move. So, whereas it's obviously less than 60 inches for its displacement. Anyway, that's a great one. I'm really glad that got pointed out to me as an organizer, so it's a great piece of information to have. So let's move on. The next one's around transports, and again, I agree with nearly all of the stuff that Tactical Tortoise talks about, but the bit I wanted to clarify was actually on the explodes vehicle section. So when a vehicle is reduced to 0 wounds, if it has an explodes rule, you obviously roll to resolve that rule first. Once you've determined whether it explodes or not, the next thing you do is determine the blast radius and resolve any damage. Now this happens before you disembark troops and before you remove the model of the vehicle in question. The reason being that the unit that's getting out can't be hit by the blast. So you, in the case of the truck that he used, you would roll to see if it explodes. If it does explode, you would then complete the explosion results, which would typically be a D6 blast radius or a D3 blast radius, even a 1 inch for some of the smaller light vehicles. It would deal mortal wounds to each unit within that distance. You would resolve the casualties, remove any enemy models. Then you go on to place, set up the unit. You don't disembark from it, you set it up wholly within 3. Once you've finished setting them up, then you get to remove the destroyed transport, and then you get to roll for the casualties for the unit disembarking, so on the ones that they get removed from play. So it is a very specific sequence, and it does mean that you don't hit the double whammy, which I think a lot of players misunderstand, where you have to disembark and then it explodes, and then the unit takes damage and you have to roll for injuries for disembarking on top of that. So that's not the case. So just to be clear, you roll to see if the vehicle explodes. If it does explode, you resolve that explosion. Then you complete the setup of the disembarking unit. Then you roll to see if any of those models are destroyed after you've removed the transport vehicle. Point 6 is about lookout, sir, and targeting characters. This is a rule that confused the hell out of me when 9th edition first dropped, because it is slightly different to 8th edition. Because of the way that they've kind of changed it a couple of times with FAQs in recent months, over the past 12 months. Now, it is 100% correct in that the character basically needs to be the closest and in line of sight to be targeted. If you can't meet both those criteria, then you can't target the character. As long as the character then meets the lookout sir requirements of having 3 friendly models, or certain wounds characteristics and certain sizes of vehicles and so on. Point 7, who can fight. This is a fantastic part of the video. I thoroughly recommend you go and check out the examples here. There's obviously a link to the video in the notes below. This talks about how you end up in a scenario where you can charge an enemy unit and they potentially don't get to fight back if you're clever in your positioning and how you pile in and consolidate. It also very clearly explains, and a lot of players still get this one wrong, that a heroic intervention isn't actually a charge move. So none of the benefits, unless they're specifically listed as heroic intervention, you actually don't get the benefits of any of the charging rules. So this would be my number 1 part of the video to go and watch. Go and check out some of the tricks you can pull with manipulating how you complete charges, how you pile in, how you consolidate, and how you can deny your opponent to fight back in cases where you'd think they definitely should be able to. It's definitely worth watching. And point 8. Point 8's about actions, and I think this is one that the community's still kind of coming to grips with, because the edition's not that old and most of the community hasn't played that many games. So there is a full section of this in the GT handbook. There'll be a reference after this particular segment to show you all of the references. However, what it means is that as long as you, if you're charged, you can still pile in, fight, and consolidate and still complete an action. It's basically anything that's voluntary you can't complete. Although I will point out you can still deny psychic powers as well. Manifesting you can't, but denying you definitely can. So actions are one of those things. Again, he outlines this really well in the video. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can't do, but you can pile in, fight, consolidate, deny. You can also only have, unless an action tells you specifically you can only ever perform each action once per battle round, and each unit can only perform 1 action per battle round as well. Now there are obviously some differences with some of the specific actions, but by and large you can't complete the same action multiple times. You can't do scramblers in 1 turn, because it has to be done once per battle round. So it's definitely worth going and reading the GT 2020 handbook page on actions. It outlines it all really clearly there, and it's definitely worth checking out if you're going to a tournament. Right, that's it. I just want to say thank you to Tactical Tortoise for producing their video. It's a great video, and I think the fact that they're trying to widen the community's knowledge of some of the intricacies of the game is fantastic. And the only really sort of niggling one that I have with the video was actually around Wobbly Model. I think the rest of the video is really informative, and I think there's also the potential that some of the idiosyncrasies of regionally based play might be creeping into my opinions versus his opinions. It's a bit hard to say because ultimately the game is hugely complex, and he says this himself, and it's not as cut and dried as we'd like it to be in some places. But I think there's a lot of room there for players and organisers to come together and make sure that we're all trying to play a similar game as we possibly can, because that's the ultimate goal. If we can, over the past few years, get ourselves to a point where we are all playing the same game, it doesn't matter where you travel in the world. Once travel is viable again, we can go and play games with whoever you meet, knowing that you're playing the same game. So you should definitely go and check out Tactical Tortoise. There's a link in the notes below. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching. We'll see you on the next video.